Hi there, welcome back, and today we're going to be discussing the Marxist theory of structural change. So, Karl Marx is associated with the concept dialectical materialism, or material dialecticism, by the way. The idea here is that society is, according to Marx, who was an economist, a political economist, not really a sociologist, does develop primarily by economic means, but not by technology per se, but rather by the whole mode of production and the interest that it creates. So each stage of history is defined by its core economic technology. This is the mode of production. And each mode of production requires a system of control. This system of control will create, of course, inequality. Some people will be in control and some people will be controlled. So this creates what he calls this the relations of production, how people are related to each other through the act of production. So this then creates unique classes, the class of people who have the same relationship to production. So the basic differences are going to be the people who do the actual work and the people who sit around telling them what to do, ordering them around. So you'd have the ruling class and the ruled or the subservient class. So when we look at the different stages of history that we talked about before, of course, hunter-gatherer society had no classes because most work was based on purely personal effort or immediate cooperation between people. You didn't need somebody to be in charge, although there might be a lead hunter or somebody who was a leader who knew more information, but these would not be a separate class of people. They may be in charge because of their knowledge, but they wouldn't be in charge just because they had inherited this position. So more or less everybody has the same relationship to production, and usually over people's age or as they grew up, they would learn more and they would become a leader. So like I said, you wouldn't have a separate class of leaders. Everybody would become a leader in their own time. But with horticultural society, you create a surplus. This means, as we said before, something to steal, protect, and trade. And here the main distinction becomes between a separate warrior class. So the warrior class is based on the combination of thieves and protectors, which at the end of the day, it's like cops and robbers. You can't tell them apart, right? And you might also have merchants, people who make their living trading from one place to another. Of course, most people would be still involved in production. But the producers typically end up on the bottom. The other people, the warriors, have the weapons, the merchants have money so they can pay for protection, and then you usually have a class of priests who claim to know, that the gods tell them when to plant things and things like that. So these become the leading ruling classes, and the peasants are at the bottom. And over time, very often, more advanced horticultural societies created or needed, or didn't need, but it was, for the ruling classes, it was more efficient for them to have slaves. So many of these horticultural societies became slave-based societies, particularly when they became rather large. So horticultural empires, we could say, basically like the Roman Empire, like the ancient Sumerian empires, ancient Egyptian empires, all of these are horticultural because of the level of technology used. They required intensive manpower to do the planting and to do the harvesting, usually using relatively small areas of land that were intensively harvested, and not relying too much on animal power and things like that. So this is why slavery was very much an option. Or you would have semi-systems of slavery like ancient Egypt, where people would be forced to go and build the pyramids when they had their time off, right? Rather than hanging out and having fun because we got nothing to do while the crops grow, the king says, no, I need you to come and do some work for me. Build me a pyramid so I can live forever. So what we start doing, the ruling class has key interests. They want to create or prevent revolts, and they want to get more slaves. So since slaves are the basis of work, they're always going off and having wars in order to conquer more slaves. So as Marx says, all history is a history of class struggle. Once you have horticultural society, once we have history, as it were, because this is what creates civilization, you're going to have a ruling class and an oppressed ruled class. So agrarian society is usually based, as I said before, on technology that allows you to turn over the soil. So the horse-drawn plow allows you to use more land with less manpower. So you just go out and spread the seeds and it grows by itself. You don't have to intensively farm for the most part. So people are no longer the source of power. Land is the source of power. So the ruling classes are now the landowners, who were at that time called nobles, the aristocrats and the monarchs. And their ideology was, well, God gave us the land because he made me the king. Right? So how do you know he's the king? Well, I'm the king because I was born the king. Right? And if I wasn't born the king, I conquered the kinghood. Either way, God approved it. Okay? Just believe me. So, of course, the dominated class are the serfs. Now, the serfs don't need to be slaves anymore. They're not owned personally by the lords or the landlords, but their situation is very similar because they basically are stuck on the land, and every year the landlord's going to come around and hit them on the head and say, pay me rent, right? Because this is God gave me this land, and I'm just letting you use it in the meantime, right? So their key interests, of course, they have to go out and collect taxes. That's going to create rebellions and revolts, so they have to put them down. And of course, they constantly have to conquer more land, or they're competing to conquer land from other nobles. So warfare is very important. I'm afraid that it's always important. And then you have capitalism. Now, in the agrarian society, again, you have the merchants and you have the cities producing goods. But these then grow. And why do they grow? Because of the competition of the nobles. The nobles are fighting with each other. They need better weapons. They need more money. They need more trade goods. So they end up building up this class that Marx calls the bourgeoisie, which bourgeois simply is a French word for the city, people who live in the city. Right? So the city dwellers, the capitalists, they start to become wealthier and wealthier. And they create a system of industry in which they have workers working for them. Now, Marx called them the proletariat. So, unfortunately, this is a Latin word for the regular people, basically, the proles, sometimes you might call them. Right? So the capitalists, or the bourgeoisie, constantly are competing with each other. They have to exploit the workers. They have to make a surplus, maximize their profits, and expand production through conquering new markets. And often they do this also through war, or they have to protect their markets through military intervention. So again, warfare is very important. The suppression of workers is very important, making sure workers don't get too powerful. And so, again, history continues. So this is what he calls the dialectical process. The process is not so much between the ruling class and the ruled class. The dialectical process is between the mode of production and the relations of production. So as at any particular time you have a mode of production with a ruling class, they want to cement their control, so they create religions and values and norms and things like that. Now, as far as Marx are concerned, these are not really important historically. They don't have any role in history. They're only there to suppress the masses and keep them down, right? But what is important is that they are creating constantly new technologies that eventually will create a new mode of production. And this is a paradox, because when the new mode of production comes along, it's going to require new relations of production, right? So here you can imagine the aristocrats, they're fighting with each other for domination. They need more weapons, they need more money, they need bigger armies. So as a result, they build up this merchant class of the bourgeoisie, and eventually the bourgeoisie says, well, why do we need you guys around, right? We're the ones who control all the factories, we control all the production, we control all the trade. All you guys do is stand around buying new suits and going to war. Right? So we can do that. We don't need you. So they get rid of the aristocrats, right? That was the revolution that Marx lived through, as it were, the French Revolution or the revolutions of the 18th and 19th centuries, probably beginning with the American Revolution, frankly, right? So all these revolutions were revolutions which the aristocrats lost their power and the bourgeoisie, the new capitalists, took over power, and they created a new ideology. So all these systems are based on exploitation. Slave comes along. Of course, the slave is owned by the slave owner, so anything he does is owned by the slave owner. In return, he's given barely enough to live on. The serf, he grows his own food, okay, but then the landlord comes along, knocks him on the head, give me half your food for rent, and then the priest comes along, knocks him on the head, give me the rest, give me the half of what you got left, so otherwise you go to hell, and then whoever else comes along and knocks him on the head, etc. In capitalism, it works a little differently because the worker is free to work for whoever he wants, but this is the trick. He can't work unless he's given a job. Who gives out the jobs? Well, in general, in capitalist society, it's large capitalists, the people who own most of the money. So how does this process work? So you have a capitalist, let's say he's got $1 million. He wants to invest his money. Now, obviously, he wants to make more money, right? So he invests part of his money in raw materials, in machinery, in factories and things like that. But these things can't work by themselves. They can't produce value. The only thing that can produce value is what labor, workers. Only workers can produce value because they're the ones who actually have to do what needs to be done to create value. So he hires the workers. Now when he hires them, he's paying them for his time. So during the time that they're hired for, 8 hours a day or whatever, anything they do belongs to him because their time is his time. So they're kind of like a slave in that sense, except they're not owned by the capitalist, they're rented by the capitalist. So in any way, the capitalist, let's say, has spent a total of $1 million to rent or buy materials, factories, rent workers to do the work, and the result of this is a certain amount of product, let's say a number of cars. The capitalist then sells the cars because they belong to him, right? And let's say he gets back $2 million. Okay, the exact amount is not important. The important thing is he wants to get back more than he put in, right? But wait a second, this doesn't make any sense. $1 million equals a certain amount of raw materials and machinery plus a certain amount of labor equals a certain number of products equals $2 million. Now, if you know anything about math, you know that $1 million cannot equal $2 million. These are two different amounts of money. So where did this $1 million come from, this extra $1 million? Well, according to Marx, this extra $1 million comes from where the value was produced. That means it comes from the worker. He actually produced the value. So in effect, he produced $2 million of value, but he's only given a part of $1 million of value. Right? The rest of it is in the machinery, and of course the machinery itself was produced by previous labor. Now you might say to me, hold it, doesn't the capitalist deserve some return on his investment? Well, what did he do? He certainly deserves a wage, maybe somewhat equivalent to the amount he's paying the workers, maybe a little bit more because of his additional skills. but not $1 million more. So what Marx is saying is that this difference is actually surplus value produced by the worker, but taken by the capitalist as his profit. So profit is what is exploited or taken from the worker during the process of production. Now, why does the capitalist do this? Why does he feel he deserves an extra $1 million? Well, it's not necessarily because he's greedy, although he could be, but that is the thing. It's the system he's in. The capitalist constantly has to reinvest. Otherwise, he stops being a capitalist because he cannot compete with other capitalists. So in order to reinvest, he needs to take that $2 million and then put it back into the system, and then it becomes new machinery, new labor, new products. The next cycle, it'll be 3 million or 4 million. So in this process, the capitalist gets richer and richer, or he controls more and more of the wealth of society. The factories themselves get more and more complicated. The products get more and more complex. What about the worker? Well, he stays more or less the same. So relative to the capitalist, he's actually becoming cheaper and cheaper with every cycle. Now in this process, another thing happens which Marx calls alienation. Right? Alienation is this idea that we become alienated or foreign. The word alien here doesn't mean from outer space. It means something that is outside of you. Right? So, for example, you're a human. You produce things. That's what you do as a human being. Right? You make things. You have creativity. You have your head, and your nature. The nature of humans, what makes humans different from other animals, is that we create things, right? But in capitalism, the worker doesn't create. Well, he creates, but it's like he creates, but he never controls what he creates, because he's working for somebody else when he creates. So in other words, he's alienated from what he creates, right? So the worker, you're making shoes, but as soon as you make those shoes, in fact, even while you're making them, they never belong to you, right? They're never part of your creative process. And then in the process of production, you're controlled by machines, you are controlled by the profit motive. So the very process of production is outside of you, again, right? So you're the one making the shoes, but you don't control how you make them. At the same time, you see other workers as your competitors, right? They're going to steal your job if they have half the chance. So you end up fighting with your fellow workers instead of fighting with the boss, who's the one actually taking away your livelihood, right? You're fighting with people. Oh, he's a different color. He's a different race. Oh, we can't let those people in the factory. They'll steal all our jobs, right? So you become alienated from your fellow men. You see other people as objects of competition rather than fellow human beings. Right? And finally, if you think about it, your very nature, your very human nature, your creative and productive nature, your ability to be human becomes something you hate. You hate going to work because it's boring, because you're told what to do, because you have no control over your life. You're only happy when you go home and you can get drunk and you can do crazy things. This is what Marx says. He says, as a result, therefore, man, the worker, only feels himself freely active in his animal functions, eating, drinking, procreating, or at most in his dwelling and in dressing up, etc. And in his human functions, production, he no longer feels himself to be anything but an animal. What is animal becomes human. What is human becomes animal. This is what motivated Karl Marx. But what was the solution? You see, Karl Marx was, at the end of the day, an optimist. He believed that capitalist competition had so advanced production that we could get rid of the capitalists and the machinery would still operate. We can just get rid of them. And if we get rid of the capitalists, we don't need to make a profit. People could work far less, right? You think about how much time we spend at work because we constantly have to compete with everybody else. If we didn't have to compete, we wouldn't have to work so hard. We could spend more time enjoying our work, perhaps, or doing other things we really want to do. So he believed that if you created a society free of force, that humans would become their true nature, this true cooperative and socially productive nature would emerge. And they would be willing to work based on what they felt they needed to do. Right? Now, this is what he called communism, that people would own the world in common. We would share. Right? It didn't mean we'd all share the same toothbrush or share the same shoe. No, we would still have our own things, and we would still live our own lives. In fact, he saw this as a period of hyper-individuality, kind of similar to Durkheim's vision of future society. Right? Everybody would be free to do their own things because we wouldn't be controlled by the system of production. We wouldn't be controlled by the system that forces us to exploit each other. This is what he meant when he said, from each according to his abilities, to each according to his needs. So the idea Marx was saying is, we don't want equality because people aren't the same. You don't want to give everybody one pair of shoes and one shirt and one tie or whatever. You want to allow people to take what they need, whatever they need. Right? Imagine a society where you would just go and say, I need this. Okay, here it is. I need to go to Moscow to visit my friends. Oh, okay, here's a ticket to Moscow. How would that work? We don't know because we're not in that society. From each according to his abilities. Again, people are not equal. Some people are intellectual. They can think about things. Other people like to work hard. They like to work with their hands. Right? Some people are strong. They can lift things. So you'd say, look, everybody, you give what you can. This is your ability. And you take what you need. Because people don't have the same needs and they don't have the same abilities. So when people think of communism as, oh, everybody's going to have the same stuff, that wasn't what Marx envisioned at all. Right? But unfortunately, that's what we ended up getting, or the people in the Soviet Union ended up getting, which technically Marx called socialism. But let's not get too complicated here. We're still in high school. But this is the thing. Is this believable? Do you think this could happen? A lot of people just say this is impossible. Human nature is not that way. Human nature is to take as much as you can. Right? So you're going to have people that constantly want to travel and never want to do anything. Right? People are greedy. People are lazy. In other words, we go back to this idea of people as sinful, evil, and need to be controlled. We need society to control people, right? Now, obviously, Marx didn't agree. He thought that it was the system that was evil. The system made people greedy and lazy. So if you created a society where people were free to express themselves, they would want to work, or they would want to be productive, they would want to share their abilities with other people. But at the end of the day, this is a debate about human nature. It's about arguing about the number of angels who can dance on a pin. It's not something we can resolve with sociology. Can we test it? Well, some people say they did. They tried to test it. They set up the Soviet Union, a socialist paradise, and look what happened. They turned back to capitalism. They couldn't compete. Well, does the fact that communism has not worked prove Marx wrong? Again, it doesn't, because any one experiment is one case. You've got the Soviet Union, you've got China, you've got Vietnam, you've got Cuba. Okay, 5 cases, but still, maybe the way they did the experiment was wrong. Maybe they carried it out wrong. Maybe it was Stalin's fault. Maybe it was Lenin's fault. The point is, I'm not saying Marx was correct. I'm just saying that we do not have evidence to show one way or the other, right? But also the issue of alienation is something which is it's a philosophical question, not a scientific question. It's not something we can really prove one way or the other, unless you were to set up a perfect society, or maybe you could study people who grew up in communes or in kibbutzes to find out if they really feel differently about the world. So why is Marx so influential today? Because if you take away his prognosis or theory about communism, a lot of what he says about capitalism is still very, very valid and can be approached scientifically. So industrialization technology has certainly produced vast wealth for the rich, but the poor are still poor. We have large numbers of unemployed. If you look at the world as a whole, massive numbers of people in the world are still unemployed or underemployed. They are earning far less than they should be. We have half the world surviving on between $1 and $2 a day. So this is still a situation where there's masses of inequality in the world, and some people argue that this is creating revolutions, this is creating conflict. So even if you put aside the arguments about communism, these analysis of the present day are still quite valid. So thank you very much for joining our lecture on Marx, and make sure again before you take the quiz, check the companion for other assignments and for review. Bye.